All right, lovely students. So I'm just going to briefly talk about the assignment 2.01 as you are or were to compare the statue of Khafra, the Egyptian statue, with early Greek archaic. So let's go ahead and dive into it. This is the one that was given in the assignment, but Greek heroes were a very common subject and were done quite a bit. So here's another early one that I'm sharing with you, as well as I thought, to best kind of answer this question, you need to pull up more imagery of not only the statue of Keref, but also just general Egyptian sculptures. One of the tasks were to point out the similarities or the influences that we're seeing between Egyptian as well as Greeks. You have to remember, Greeks came from a time period. I mean, right before that was the geometric period, and they had a slump artistically. They weren't coming up with their own new ideas. They were being influenced just through their neighboring cultures through trade and commerce. And that was very important. And that's what happened with the Egyptians. So, through the idea of trade, they're seeing what the Egyptians are doing. And the Egyptians had a long standing canon or set of rules of what their art looked like. So, naturally, as any of us learn how to make art, we tend to copy the pros. So, the Egyptians were considered the pros at the time. And the early Greek sculptors were like, I want to do that too. So let's take a look at kind of some of those similarities, all right? Some key characteristics of Egyptian kind of art was their pose. Like we understood and we saw some artwork earlier that they have this very rigid feel. And when we look at their two-dimensional works, they were always seen as a profile, a twisted perspective, and it was very simple in terms of line work. If we look at their three-dimensional artwork, such as statues, it feels very regal. It feels very like powerful and loyal and stable. All of the good characteristics that they want their kings and wealthy class to exhibit. Um, but in doing that, they always carve from a huge block of like material, whether that be like a marble or something, right? Or limestone. And it feels very blocky, okay? And so they still carry this very rigid, kind of almost like Tin Man robot feel through their statues. There's nothing kind of natural. Not to say that, standing up straight is unnatural, but just even the angular of the rigid of the like the elbows here and the hands, it's very formal. I mean, if we look here, we have clutched fists and, just kind of this very robotic stance as they move forward. Okay. But they did typically always have a foot forward, and the arms were always off to the side. The shoulders were up and high. And there was no sense of fluidity, no sense of movement. And when I say movement, there's nothing that like you don't look at and go, wow, that's blowing in the wind. It's very like, I put this here and I'm not going to be knocked down. I mean, it had this very heavy sort of feel. Okay. Um, and those were all kind of reminiscent of Egyptian style characteristics. In addition, we did talk about, I think, in a previous artwork, that they don't really have a sense of identity. They were more or less generic male, generic female. And the only reason we knew that they were a particular king or queen was maybe the decoration or just through where it was being housed. Okay. If we take a look at the Greeks, so those are the things essentially the Greeks stole, and you can see that here. And when I say stole, I say that nicely. They're trying to learn from the pros. So you can see here that they also adopted the very rigid, upright stance. Okay, very like hard edged, sort of muscular shoulders. Arms completely down to the side. They also have a foot forward, so you can see that here. And they also have the closed fists. That is kind of where they're kind of seeing the direct connection. Now, you were asked to compare to this one, so you have to, reference specifics here, and you can still do that with the clenched fist, the symmetrical, like it's very symmetrical, like the left half is the exact same as the right half. And we can see that here, proportions, they were trying to be perfectly symmetrical on either side. but you still have that rigid, like my back is sitting up super, super straight, and it's not very natural. But we can see that in this way, in this piece as well, even though this king here is sitting, okay, whereas this one is standing. All right. If we're also looking at just comparing this one and this one, trying to make some more connections, you can definitely say that the Greeks weren't trying or aiming to have a sense of individuality either. Okay, not that they were making sculptures of kings, because that wasn't appropriate there. If anything, they were referencing either athletes or gods. Um, but what we're noticing again is it's very generic in terms of the eyes, nose, mouth. It doesn't, you're not getting a sense of a personality. You're not getting a sense of an individuality. Going back to that, like little, I'm just thinking like, what's the difference between a Joe and a Sam? Well, they're the same. They're the exact same person. So you can say that that is something that's being connected between this one and this one. I mentioned the symmetry on both in the rigid. Then the other thing too that you could mention specifically about this statue of Carafe and the archaic is no fluidity. Okay, so as I said before, it's no fluidity. So if we're looking at clothes or like the drapery or the headdress, it's very stiff. It doesn't have a sense of cloth or movement or fabric. Even like the facial hair right here, if that's considered, I mean, I know it's decorative, something that they put on, but it's still very hard, rough, and like it doesn't have a sense of texture, it doesn't have any sense of fluidity. If we look at our archaic, or I'm sorry, yeah, our archaic curios here, if you look at their hair, it's also very rigid. And it almost it gives the illusion of braids, but they're in these like very straight rows, and there's no sense of like flowing hair. No, no hair is blowing in the wind here. Okay. It's just very like thick, and it feels and looks like stone. And granted, I understand it's made out of stone, and you're supposed to be like, how am I supposed to make hair out of stone look like hair? Well, trust me, because going forward, you're going to start noticing how the Greeks do eventually learn how to do that, and it's so impressive when we get there. So like that's a little like planting the seeds for what to come in Greek classical and Hellenistic. But they do learn how to take a material such as stone and make it feel alive. But right now it very much is not. It has that very rigid and no sense of movement to it. Okay, so those are some connections between the two. If you had to talk about, well, what's uniquely Greek, like you can only be a copycat so much before your own ideas trickle through. And if we're looking at the Greek archaics, they had a stronger, like they as an artisans had a stronger sense of humanity and wanting to really dive into the human form. And in doing so, they kind of were looking at the human body more closely. So you can see here they're trying to refine muscle tones. They tend to refine and soften like the proportions. So if you look at the proportions of this foot, it's more natural, right? The top of our toes tends to be wider. We go down as we get to our ankle, it gets thinner. And even from our ankle up to our calf, then coming back into our knee, which seems to be a little bit softer. We're polishing up, we're refining is what we call it. We're refining those proportions. Whereas if you look at the Egyptians, it's very blocky sort of feel. Okay. So that's something that the Greek archaics were doing. They were also trying to really figure out facial expressions. And this gets known as the archaic smile. It's like super cheesy, but it doesn't matter if it was a warrior, a god, doesn't matter the emotion or the action of the statue. In order to make it lifelike, in their mind, they were thinking if I just put a smile, it will be alive. And not to think of it like a spiritual, like, oh, a smile equates to this like statue being a real life spirit. But you have to think back, like, I want you to really think back when you were a kid and you were learning how to draw a person. and trying to show mom and dad, and you're like 2 and 3. How did you draw yourself, or how did you draw mom and dad? You drew a circle, two dots, and a smile with a simple line. And everything was a smile. And in your brain, that equated to a real person. And you were showing life. So the same concept applies here. So don't view as it's silly. It's just how our brains are kind of making sense of things that they put on what's called cheese. Well, it's not called cheesy. It's called archaic smiles, but I always remember it because it's cheesy. It's like that, like say cheese, and you put this big smile on there. So unfortunately, I don't have like a close up, but if you study the curos a little bit more closely within the Greek archaic, you're going to see a bunch of cheesy smiles that don't necessarily make sense, but at the time right now, it's what they use to contribute to like making the statue feel more lifelike. Okay. So hopefully that has helped you, and you can add that to your written response.